The IRS no longer focuses on individual returns. They're focusing on preparer patterns. Listen, a problem with a single return can look like an error, a mistake. But when dozens or hundreds of returns share the same characteristics, the IRS may see something completely different. It may see a questionable compliance cluster, and clusters trigger civil and/or criminal enforcement. So how does the IRS go about identifying clusters? Well, the IRS is now tracking preparers through unique identifiers. As you know, every preparer has a PTIN. Every e-file provider has an EFIN. That allows the IRS to group returns together based on who prepared them or what company. Once grouped, the IRS applies statistical analysis. They compare returns across peer groups, comparing to other preparers and companies. They identify statistical anomalies, and they look for questionable compliance patterns that repeat across multiple taxpayers and tax years. Questionable compliance clusters usually share repeated tells. For example, unusually high refundable credit or low reported net income compared to the peer groups. Repeated use of the same employer data across unrelated taxpayers. Identical withholding patterns that do not match real wages, or refunds routed through the same financial channel. Individually, these might not raise suspicion, but together they form a questionable compliance pattern. And patterns are what the IRS civilly and criminally acts on now. The IRS doesn't need a traditional audit to begin a civil and/or criminal tax enforcement anymore. It's now starting with pure data. They're using automated systems augmented by AI and advanced analytics, and they're doing that to identify high-risk compliance clusters before ever contacting a taxpayer or a preparer. From there, civil and/or criminal tax enforcement moves really quickly. Because the IRS is no longer guessing, it's verifying patterns across multiple returns at once. Well, when the IRS identifies a questionable compliance cluster, it often shifts from individual taxpayers to looking at the preparer themselves. This is now called network enforcement. If you're lucky, the IRS is going to come in and assess preparer penalties. They're going to investigate the preparer's business or seek an injunction to shut down the operation entirely. That's serious. I've handled several. In serious cases, the IRS can revoke e-filing privileges. At that point, the preparer's ability to operate can effectively be eliminated. Most cluster cases start as civil matters, but criminal tax exposure increases when the IRS sees things like fabricated documents, false wage statements, inflated credits, or identity theft patterns. At that point, the IRS no longer sees individual errors, it sees a scheme. And when a scheme is identified, that's when the IRS Criminal Investigation Division becomes involved. Well, many taxpayers believe they're protected because the preparer handled their return. Well, that's not how the IRS sees it. Listen, the way they view it is if you sign the return, you are responsible for its contents, even if a preparer made promises of guaranteeing a refund. And if the IRS identifies your return as part of a criminal or civil compliance cluster, you're going to be pulled into the civil and/or criminal tax investigation against the preparer, even if you didn't understand the issues involved. So what are the most dangerous mistakes we see people making in cluster cases? The biggest mistakes we see here are when the taxpayer or their preparers try to mitigate their own exposure informally, while often relying on the wrong representatives, ones not trained to understand what they're dealing with. Mistakes include recreating or altering documents, using template explanations, or aligning your story with what the IRS expects. These actions may create consistency, but they'll decimate your credibility. And consistency without credibility is exactly what the IRS uses to prove criminal tax intent. This is why early strategy matters. If you believe that your return or your returns may be part of a questionable compliance preparer cluster, civil or criminal tax investigation, or you're a preparer that received correspondence related to the repeated questionable compliance patterns, you should assume the civil or criminal tax compliance risk is elevated here. At the tax law offices of David W. Klasing, our dual licensed tax attorneys and CPAs handle these matters as both civil and criminal tax exposure cases. We control communication, we protect your position, and we build a defensible record. Call 1-800-681-1295 or visit Klasing-associates.com to schedule a confidential, reduced rate initial consultation today. You won't regret it.